My name is Natalie Cooper, and I'm 27 years old. I thought I had everything figured out as a marketing director in Chicago until one voicemail destroyed my entire world. Standing in my apartment kitchen after a grueling 12-hour workday, I was exhausted but proud of landing a major client when I pressed play on my mother's message. Natalie, this is your final warning. You are not family anymore. Don't come back to Denver. We're moving on without you. Your brother Tyler and I have had enough of your selfishness. The phone slipped from my trembling hands as I realized something terrible had happened. Before we dive into this shocking story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you're ready to hear how my own mother tried to destroy my life, smash that like button and hit subscribe because this story will show you just how far family betrayal can go. Trust me, you won't believe what happens next. The first thing I did was frantically call back, my fingers shaking as I dialed the number I'd known by heart since childhood. The automated voice felt like a slap across my face. The number you have dialed has been disconnected. I tried again, thinking I'd misdialed in my panic, but got the same cold message. Racing to my laptop, I logged into Facebook, Instagram, every social media platform where my family existed, only to find myself blocked from everything. My mother Linda, my 23-year-old brother Tyler, even extended family members I barely spoke to had completely erased me from their digital lives. 6 months earlier, I'd left Denver after a heated argument with my mother about not visiting enough. She'd accused me of choosing my career over family, of being selfish and ungrateful. I'd stormed out, telling her I needed space to think, that I'd call when I was ready. The irony was devastating because I'd been planning a surprise visit for her 60th birthday next week. The plane ticket was already purchased, sitting in my email like a cruel joke. I'd even bought her favorite lavender perfume and a silk scarf I knew she'd love. Desperate for answers, I called Mrs. Henderson, our longtime family friend who'd known me since I was 5 years old. Her voice was cold when she finally answered, nothing like the warm woman who used to bake me cookies every summer. Natalie, I think you have some nerve calling here after what you've done to your poor mother. My heart stopped. What are you talking about? I haven't done anything. But Mrs. Henderson had already made up her mind. She told me how my mother had been going around the neighborhood, tears streaming down her face, telling everyone how I'd abandoned the family and stolen money from Tyler's college fund. The lies were spreading like wildfire through our tight-knit Denver community. I called my cousin Jake, my aunt Susan, even my high school best friend Emma. Each conversation was the same nightmare. They'd all heard the same story. That I was a selfish daughter who'd taken money that belonged to my brother, that I'd been cruel to my mother during her time of grief after losing my father to cancer 2 years ago. The worst part was that none of them would listen to my side of the story. They'd already decided I was guilty. Tyler's silence cut the deepest. My little brother, who used to call me his hero, wouldn't answer my calls. I could see that he was reading my texts, but there were no responses. I sent him screenshots of the $3,000 I'd transferred to his account last Christmas for tuition, proof that I'd never taken anything from him. The read receipts showed he'd seen everything, but still nothing. My mother had turned my own brother against me so thoroughly that he wouldn't even hear my voice. As the hours turned into days, I began to understand that this wasn't just anger or misunderstanding. My mother had systematically turned everyone I'd ever loved against me with carefully crafted lies. She'd painted herself as the victim and me as the villain so convincingly that people who'd known me my entire life believed I was capable of stealing from my own family. The isolation was suffocating. Every morning I woke up hoping it was all a nightmare, but the disconnected phone numbers and blocked social media profiles were very real. The breaking point came on the third night when I found myself collapsed on my bathroom floor, hyperventilating as the full reality of my situation hit me. I wasn't just estranged from my family, I was being systematically destroyed by the woman who'd given birth to me. She'd weaponized everyone I loved against me, and I had no idea why or how to fight back. In that moment, curled up on the cold tile, I realized my mother hadn't just disowned me. She'd declared war. Unable to bear another sleepless night, I drove the 14 hours from Chicago to Denver, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I needed to see my mother face to face, to demand an explanation for the lies she'd been spreading. But when I turned onto Maple Street, the street where I'd grown up, my childhood home looked like it belonged to strangers. There was a bright red for sale sign planted in the front yard, and all the curtains were gone from the windows. The house looked hollow, empty, abandoned. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, staring at the place where I'd taken my first steps, learned to ride a bike, and said goodbye to my father for the last time. Now it was just an empty shell, and my family had vanished without telling me. Mrs. Patterson from next door came out to get her mail and noticed me sitting there. When I rolled down my window to ask about my family, her expression was a mixture of pity and disgust. "Oh honey, they moved about 2 months ago. Didn't leave any forwarding address, but I don't blame them after what you put them through." Mrs. Patterson proceeded to tell me how my mother had come to her in tears multiple times, showing bank statements that supposedly proved I'd been draining the family accounts. She described documents with my name forged on withdrawal slips, transfers that I'd never made, and a pattern of financial abuse that painted me as a calculating thief. My mother had been thorough, creating a paper trail that made her look like the victim of her own daughter's greed. The neighbors had rallied around her, offering support during what they believed was her time of crisis. The revelation that shook me most came when I decided to visit my Uncle David, my father's brother who'd always been like a second father to me. He lived only 10 minutes away, but when I knocked on his door, he looked at me like I was a dangerous stranger. "You've got a lot of nerve showing up here after what you've done," he said through the barely cracked door. When I tried to explain that I hadn't done anything wrong, he slammed it in my face, telling me I was dead to the family and should be ashamed of myself for dishonoring my father's memory. Driving aimlessly through Denver, trying to process how completely my world had been turned upside down, I remembered something important. My grandmother Rose had passed away 8 months ago, leaving behind what I thought was a modest inheritance that was supposed to help the family. My mother had been the executor of the will, handling all the legal paperwork while Tyler and I grieved. She'd told us the estate was smaller than expected, just enough to cover grandmother's final expenses with a little left over to split 3 ways. Something about that memory nagged at me, so I drove to the courthouse and requested a copy of my grandmother's will. What I discovered there changed everything I thought I knew about my family's situation. According to the official document, my grandmother hadn't left a small estate at all. She'd left over $200,000, and most shocking of all, she'd left everything to me. Not split between her 3 grandchildren, not divided equally among her children, but specifically to me because I'd been her primary caregiver during her final years. The will was crystal clear. To my beloved granddaughter Natalie Cooper, who sacrificed her own comfort to care for me with grace and love during my illness, I leave my entire estate, knowing she will use it wisely and with the kindness she has always shown me. There were specific mentions of how I'd moved back home for 6 months to help nurse my grandmother through cancer treatments, how I'd taken leave from my job to drive her to appointments, how I'd been the one reading to her every night when she couldn't sleep. Sitting in the courthouse parking lot, staring at legal documents that proved my mother had been lying about the inheritance for months, I began to piece together the real conspiracy. My mother had been stealing my inheritance, using grandmother's money to fund Tyler's expensive college and probably much more. When the lawyer started asking questions or when she realized she couldn't hide the theft much longer, she needed a scapegoat. She needed someone to blame for the missing money, and she'd chosen me. The systematic destruction of my reputation suddenly made perfect sense. By accusing me of stealing Tyler's college money and abandoning the family, she was creating a narrative that would explain why I might have also stolen the inheritance. If everyone already believed I was a selfish thief, they'd never question her version of events when the truth about grandmother's money inevitably came to light. She wasn't just disowning me, she was framing me for crimes she'd committed herself. That evening, I knelt beside my grandmother's grave as the sun set over Denver's skyline, sobbing as the full scope of the betrayal became clear. The woman who'd raised me, who'd taught me right from wrong, who'd held me when my father died, had been methodically destroying my life to cover up her own crimes. She'd stolen my inheritance, turned my brother against me, poisoned my entire community with lies, and then made me disappear so I couldn't fight back. In that moment, surrounded by the silence of the cemetery where my grandmother and father rested, I made a promise. I was going to find my family, expose the truth, and get justice for everyone who'd been betrayed. The next morning, I walked into the law office of Patricia Williams, the attorney who'd handled my grandmother's estate. I'd called ahead, explaining that I was the beneficiary and had some questions about the inheritance. Ms. Williams was a sharp woman in her 50s who took one look at the documents I'd brought and immediately understood the gravity of the situation. She confirmed that the bank statements my mother had shown the neighbors were sophisticated forgeries, but she warned me that proving theft and fraud would be difficult without more concrete evidence. "Your mother was very clever about this, Ms. Williams explained, spreading the paperwork across her desk. She had legal authority as executor, so any legitimate transactions would appear normal on the surface. But these forged documents suggesting you stole money create a narrative that benefits her if questions arise about missing inheritance funds. She recommended I hire a private investigator to locate my family and gather evidence of the systematic fraud that had been committed against me. Jake Morrison was a former police detective who specialized in financial crimes and family disputes. Within 48 hours of hiring him, he'd traced my family to Austin, Texas, where they'd purchased a house in an upscale neighborhood using cash. The property records showed the purchase price was exactly $150,000, money that had clearly come from my grandmother's estate. Tyler was enrolled at a prestigious private university that cost $60,000 per year, the same education my mother had claimed she couldn't afford just months earlier. But the investigation revealed something even more disturbing. My mother had been busy in Austin, spreading the same lies about me to their new community. She'd joined a local church, a book club, and a neighborhood association, telling everyone about her abusive daughter who'd stolen money and threatened violence against the family. Jake had recordings of conversations where she described me as mentally unstable, dangerous, and obsessed with getting revenge against her for standing up to my manipulation. The most devastating discovery was that Linda had filed a restraining order against me in Travis County, Texas. According to the legal documents, I had supposedly been stalking my family, making threatening phone calls, and showing up uninvited at their new home. The restraining order painted me as an unstable individual who posed a physical danger to my mother and brother. It was a masterful legal maneuver because it meant that any attempt I made to contact my family or prove my innocence could result in my arrest for violating the order. Jake's investigation uncovered another layer to my mother's deception. She'd been having an online relationship with a married man named Roger Hendricks for over a year. Roger lived in Austin, which explained why she'd chosen that city for their fresh start. Bank records showed she'd been sending him money from the inheritance, paying for his expensive dinners, gifts, and even helping with his credit card debt. While she'd been playing the grieving widow to gain sympathy from our Denver community, she'd actually been planning her escape to Texas with her boyfriend. The evidence of systematic theft was overwhelming, but accessing it legally was another matter entirely. The restraining order prevented me from approaching my family directly, and Jake warned me that any contact could result in criminal charges. My mother had created a perfect trap. She'd stolen my inheritance, destroyed my reputation, and then used the legal system to prevent me from defending myself. Every move I made to seek justice could be interpreted as harassment or stalking. Meanwhile, my health was deteriorating rapidly from the stress. I was experiencing daily panic attacks, chronic insomnia, and I'd lost 15 pounds because anxiety made eating nearly impossible. The emotional abuse of being systematically erased from my own family's life was taking a severe physical toll. I'd started seeing a therapist, but even she was shocked by the calculated cruelty of what my mother had orchestrated. This level of manipulation and gaslighting is consistent with severe personality disorders, she told me. Your mother has essentially waged psychological warfare against you. The most heartbreaking part was watching from a distance as Tyler seemed to be thriving in his new life. Jake's surveillance showed him laughing with friends, attending classes at his expensive university, living in a beautiful apartment near campus. My little brother, who used to call me for advice about everything from homework to girls, was completely happy without me in his life. My mother had convinced him so thoroughly that I was the villain that he'd moved on without a second thought. In his mind, cutting me out of the family had been necessary for their peace and prosperity. As I sat in my Chicago apartment, surrounded by legal documents and private investigator reports, I realized I was fighting a war where my enemy had a huge head start and all the advantages. She had my family's loyalty, a new community's sympathy, legal protections, and my inheritance money to fund her defense. All I had was the truth, and as I was learning painfully, sometimes the truth isn't enough when someone is skilled at weaponizing the legal system and human emotions against you. But I wasn't ready to give up. My grandmother hadn't raised a quitter, and my father hadn't taught me to run from bullies. If my mother wanted a war, she was going to get one. My turning point came when Eleanor Walsh, my grandmother's longtime attorney, contacted me directly. She'd been growing suspicious about Linda's handling of the estate and had been conducting her own quiet investigation. "I've known your grandmother for 30 years, she told me over coffee in downtown Chicago. Rose specifically chose you as her sole beneficiary because she was worried about your mother's financial decisions. She even mentioned concerns about Linda's gambling and online relationships." Eleanor had been building a case against my mother for months, but she'd needed a victim willing to come forward. She'd been waiting for me to discover the truth and fight back. Together, we developed a strategy that would expose Linda's fraud while staying within the bounds of the restraining order. The key was gathering evidence through legitimate legal channels rather than direct confrontation. Working with a forensic accountant, we began analyzing the patterns of withdrawals from grandmother's estate account. The evidence was damning: large cash withdrawals coinciding with Roger's financial needs, transfers to luxury goods stores, expensive restaurant charges, and payments for Tyler's education that far exceeded what a modest inheritance could support. My mother had been living like she'd won the lottery while telling everyone the estate was nearly empty. Our first major breakthrough came when Eleanor arranged a legitimate legal request for updated beneficiary information on some of grandmother's old insurance policies. This required Linda to respond officially, and her panicked reaction was telling. She immediately called Eleanor, demanding to know why questions were being raised about accounts that had been properly settled. The conversation was recorded, and Linda's defensive, aggressive tone revealed someone who knew she was in legal jeopardy. Jake Morrison had been monitoring Roger's social media and discovered that the boyfriend was growing nervous about his involvement in Linda's schemes. Roger's wife had become suspicious about his sudden financial improvements and expensive purchases. When confronted about unexplained income, Roger claimed he'd won money gambling, but his wife wasn't buying it. The pressure was causing cracks in his relationship with my mother, and people under stress tend to make mistakes. The break we'd been waiting for came when Jake managed to record a phone conversation between Linda and Roger where she admitted to forging documents to make me look like the thief. "I had to protect Tyler's future," she said in the recording. "Natalie would have wasted all of Rose's money on her fancy city lifestyle. At least this way the money stays in the family where it belongs." She also mentioned destroying original documents that would have proven my innocence. But my mother wasn't going to go down without a fight. When she realized an investigation was underway, she escalated her campaign against me. She filed additional false police reports in Austin, claiming I'd been making suicidal threats in voicemails and emails she'd supposedly received. She even went so far as to contact my employer in Chicago, telling them she was concerned about my mental state and worried I might be embezzling from them too. The attack on my professional life was devastating. My company launched an internal investigation, placing me on administrative leave while they reviewed my access to client accounts and financial records. Even though I'd done nothing wrong, the mere accusation of theft from a family member raised red flags with human resources. My manager, who'd praised my work just weeks earlier, now looked at me with suspicion and concern. The lies my mother had crafted were following me everywhere, poisoning every aspect of my life. Linda's most vicious move was creating a social media campaign portraying herself as the victim of a dangerous and unstable daughter. She posted carefully crafted messages about being afraid for Tyler's safety, about having to move to protect their family, about the mental health crisis I was allegedly experiencing. Her posts garnered sympathy and support from hundreds of people who had no idea they were being manipulated by a master manipulator. But Eleanor Walsh had been practicing law for 30 years, and she knew how to fight dirty when necessary. She arranged for a handwriting expert to analyze the forged documents, building an airtight case that would prove Linda's deception in court. More importantly, she'd been building relationships with officials in both Colorado and Texas, preparing for the day when we'd have enough evidence to file criminal charges. The pressure we were applying was working. Roger's wife had discovered the affair and was threatening divorce, which meant he could lose his house and half his assets in addition to facing potential criminal charges for helping Linda hide stolen money. Jake's surveillance showed him becoming increasingly agitated, arguing with Linda on the phone, and even meeting with a lawyer of his own. When accomplices start looking for their own legal protection, it usually means they're considering cooperation with authorities. Tyler remained the wild card in all of this. My brother was still completely loyal to our mother, believing her stories about my alleged crimes and mental instability. But Jake had noticed him asking questions about the family finances, wondering how they could afford their luxurious Texas lifestyle on Linda's supposedly modest income. Seeds of doubt were being planted, and I hoped that my little brother's natural intelligence would eventually lead him to the truth. As my counteroffensive gained momentum, I was learning valuable lessons about fighting back against psychological abuse and fraud. The key was patience, methodical evidence gathering, and refusing to let my mother's emotional manipulation distract me from the facts. She was skilled at playing the victim and turning people against me, but facts don't lie, and neither do bank records, forged documents, or recorded conversations. For the first time since receiving that devastating voicemail, I felt like I might actually win this war. Everything changed on a rainy Thursday evening when Tyler appeared at my Chicago apartment door, soaked from the storm and shaking with rage. I hadn't seen my little brother in almost a year, and he looked older, more serious, but his eyes held the same fury I'd heard in our mother's voicemail. "We need to talk," he said, pushing past me into my living room. "I want you to stop harassing Mom and admit what you've done to our family." Tyler's accusations poured out in a torrent of pain and anger. He told me how our mother cried herself to sleep every night because of my stalking and threats. How she'd shown him bank statements proving I'd stolen money meant for his education. How I'd been calling her workplace in Austin, trying to get her fired from the part-time job she'd taken to make ends meet after I'd destroyed their finances. Every word was a knife in my heart because I could see how deeply he believed every lie. I tried to remain calm as I gathered all the evidence Eleanor and Jake had compiled over the past months. Bank records showing the inheritance theft, documents proving the forgeries, recordings of Linda admitting her crimes to Roger, even surveillance photos of their expensive Austin lifestyle funded by grandmother's money. I spread everything across my coffee table like pieces of a puzzle that told the real story of our family's destruction. Tyler's reaction was immediate and explosive. "These are all fake," he shouted, sweeping half the documents onto the floor. "Mom warned me you'd try this, that you'd create fake evidence to make yourself look innocent. You're sick, Natalie. You need help, and you need to leave us alone." He accused me of hiring actors to impersonate our mother in the recordings, of doctoring bank statements, of being so desperate to avoid consequences that I'd fabricate an entire alternate reality. The conversation escalated when I showed him the original copy of grandmother's will, the one that left everything to me because of my care during her final years. Tyler's face went white as he read grandmother's words about my sacrifices and kindness, but then his expression hardened again. "Mom explained this," he said. "Grandma was manipulated by you during her illness. You isolated her from the rest of the family and poisoned her mind against us. This will isn't legitimate because you coerced a sick old woman." Our argument reached a crescendo when I played him the recording of Linda admitting to Roger that she'd forged documents to frame me. Tyler listened to our mother's voice saying I had to protect Tyler's future and Natalie would have wasted all of Rose's money, but instead of being shocked, he became even angrier. You hired someone to imitate her voice, he insisted. Technology can fake anything now. Mom told me you'd go this far to try to convince me. The breaking point came when Tyler accused me of threatening to commit suicide to manipulate the family, something I'd never done or even considered. She played me the voicemails, he said. Your voice saying you'd rather die than live without the family, trying to make us feel guilty for protecting ourselves from your abuse. I realized in that moment how thoroughly Linda had prepared for this confrontation, creating fake evidence to counter everything I might present. After Tyler stormed out, slamming my apartment door so hard it rattled the walls, my mother's retaliation was swift and vicious. She contacted my employer again, this time claiming I'd threatened Tyler during his visit and that she was terrified about what I might do next. She provided them with edited recordings that made my voice sound threatening and unstable, conversations taken out of context and manipulated to support her narrative. The HR investigation became a nightmare that consumed my professional life. My access to company systems was suspended, my clients were reassigned, and rumors spread through the office that I was involved in some kind of family financial scandal. Colleagues who'd respected my work began avoiding me in the hallways, and I could feel their whispered conversations stopping when I entered rooms. My career, which I'd worked years to build, was crumbling under the weight of my mother's lies. But Eleanor Walsh had been anticipating this escalation. She'd been working with the Travis County District Attorney's Office, building a criminal case against Linda for fraud, theft, and filing false police reports. The evidence was overwhelming, but they needed the right moment to strike. Roger's wife providing evidence of the affair and financial manipulation had been the final piece they needed. The unexpected breakthrough came from the most unlikely source. Roger's wife, Carmen, had discovered that her husband had been using their joint credit cards to fund Linda's Texas lifestyle. When she confronted him with evidence of the affair and theft, Roger panicked and tried to blame everything on my mother. He claimed Linda had manipulated him, seduced him, and threatened to accuse him of rape if he didn't help her hide the stolen money. Carmen contacted Jake Morrison directly, offering to testify about Roger's confessions and providing financial records that proved Linda's elaborate spending spree using inheritance money. She was furious about being dragged into a criminal conspiracy and wanted revenge against the woman who destroyed her marriage. Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, and Carmen was prepared to burn down Linda's entire house of lies. The walls were closing in on my mother, but she still had Tyler's unwavering loyalty and a community in Austin that believed her victim narrative. More importantly, she had one final card to play that would either destroy me completely or backfire spectacularly. I just didn't know yet what that card was, but I could feel the calm before the storm. After months of building evidence and fighting a careful legal battle, everything was about to explode in ways none of us could predict. My mother's desperation reached new heights when she learned about Carmen's cooperation with the investigation. Linda called the Austin Police Department with the most dangerous lie yet, claiming that Tyler had contacted her in terror after I'd threatened to kill both of them during his Chicago visit. According to her fabricated story, I'd shown him a gun and said I'd rather see the family dead than continue living without grandmother's inheritance money. The false police report was so detailed and convincing that an arrest warrant was issued for terroristic threats before Eleanor could intervene. Jake Morrison called me at 6 a.m, his voice tense with urgency. You need to disappear immediately, he said. Don't go to work, don't go home tonight, and don't contact anyone until we sort this out. Linda has convinced Texas authorities that you're armed and dangerous. I spent the next week hiding at my friend Michelle's apartment across town while Eleanor worked frantically to expose the false charges. Every news report about domestic violence or family murder made my stomach churn, knowing that Linda had painted me as exactly that type of dangerous person. The isolation was suffocating. I couldn't go to work, couldn't return to my apartment, couldn't even call Tyler to defend myself without risking arrest. My employer didn't wait for legal resolution. The company terminated me immediately, citing the criminal charges and stating they couldn't risk employing someone accused of threatening family members. My boss, who'd been my mentor for 3 years, couldn't even look me in the eye during the brief phone call where he delivered the news. "I'm sorry, Natalie, but we have to protect our other employees and our reputation," he said. "If these charges are dropped, we'll consider discussing your return, but for now, this is goodbye." The professional destruction was complete. Within days, word spread through Chicago's tight marketing community that I'd been fired due to criminal charges involving threats against family members. Colleagues stopped returning my calls, networking contacts disappeared, and recruiters who'd once courted me suddenly had no openings that matched my qualifications. Linda hadn't just stolen my inheritance, she'd murdered my career with surgical precision. Tyler's guilt over his role in the escalation was evident when Jake's surveillance showed him arguing frequently with Linda about the severity of the charges against me. My brother had wanted me out of their lives, but he'd never intended for me to face prison time for crimes I hadn't committed. However, whenever he expressed doubts, Linda had a powerful weapon to silence him: she threatened suicide. The suicide threats were Linda's most manipulative tool yet. She told Tyler that if he maintained any contact with me or questioned her version of events, she'd kill herself rather than watch me destroy their family completely. She'd lock herself in the bathroom with a bottle of pills, crying hysterically about how I'd driven her to this point, how she couldn't live with the stress I was causing. Tyler, terrified of losing his only remaining parent, would always back down and reaffirm his loyalty. Roger had become a liability that Linda needed to eliminate. When he started expressing concerns about the criminal charges and wanted to distance himself from her schemes, she threatened to tell his wife that he'd sexually assaulted her during their affair. The threat was credible enough to keep Roger in line, but Jake's surveillance showed him meeting with criminal defense attorneys, clearly preparing for the possibility that Linda would sacrifice him to save herself. My financial situation became desperate as legal fees drained my savings and unemployment eliminated my income. I was forced to sell my car, move out of my apartment, and rely on Michelle's generosity for basic shelter. The stress triggered a severe autoimmune flare-up that landed me in the emergency room, where doctors found my white blood cell count critically low and my inflammation markers through the roof. The psychological warfare was literally making me sick. Linda celebrated her victories publicly on social media, posting about how relieved she was that law enforcement was finally taking action against dangerous family members. She shared articles about adult children who abuse elderly parents, implying that I'd mistreated grandmother during her illness. Her posts received dozens of sympathetic comments from people who had no idea they were supporting a criminal who'd stolen from her own daughter. The deepest betrayal came when Tyler chose to testify in support of the restraining order extension, publicly stating that he feared for his and his mother's safety. My little brother, who used to build blanket forts with me and tell me I was his hero, stood in a Texas courtroom and painted me as a dangerous predator who'd threatened their lives. The local news covered the hearing, describing me as an estranged daughter accused of financial crimes and threatening behavior. But Eleanor Walsh had been building her own case with methodical precision. She'd obtained subpoenas for Linda's phone records, which proved that many of the threatening calls from me had never actually occurred. The timestamps showed that Linda had been claiming to receive calls from me at times when my phone was documented to be turned off or in airplane mode during flights. The fabricated evidence was beginning to unravel under legal scrutiny. The most devastating blow to Linda's credibility came when forensic analysis of the voicemails she'd submitted as evidence revealed digital manipulation. The threatening messages were composites created by splicing together words from legitimate conversations, rearranged to sound menacing. The technical evidence proved that my mother had been creating fake threats from me, then using those fabricated threats to justify her actions against me. As winter approached, I was living as a fugitive in my own country, destroyed financially and professionally, cut off from my family, and facing potential prison time for crimes that existed only in my mother's twisted imagination. But Eleanor kept reminding me that truth has a way of surfacing, that lies require constant maintenance while facts stand on their own. The question was whether justice would come before Linda's web of deception destroyed what little remained of my life. The breakthrough that changed everything came from the most unexpected source: our father's hidden legacy. Tyler had been going through personal items that Linda had stored in their Austin garage when he discovered a small metal box tucked behind Christmas decorations. Inside were dozens of letters our father had written but never sent, documenting concerns about Linda's behavior during his final months. The letters painted a disturbing picture of emotional abuse and manipulation that Tyler had been too young to recognize at the time. Dad wrote about Linda's affair with someone she'd met online, about her threats to turn his children against him if he exposed her infidelity, about money missing from accounts that she claimed to know nothing about. Most shocking were his suspicions that Linda was withholding his pain medication to keep him weak and dependent during his cancer treatments. Tyler found recordings our father had made on his phone, conversations with Linda where she admitted to taking money from grandmother's accounts even before grandmother had died. Dad's weak voice was heartbreaking as he begged Linda to stop stealing from his mother, threatening to contact authorities if she didn't return the money. Linda's response was chilling. She told him that if he caused trouble, she'd make sure Tyler and I never spoke to him again. The most damaging evidence was a letter Dad had tried to mail to Tyler and me just weeks before his death, warning us about Linda's manipulation and providing evidence of her crimes. He'd documented bank account numbers, dates of suspicious transactions, and even hidden copies of forged documents with Linda's fingerprints on them. The letter had never been sent because Linda had intercepted it, but Dad had kept copies hidden in the metal box. Tyler's phone call to me was the first time I'd heard his voice in months, and it was filled with anguish and confusion. "Natalie, I found something that changes everything," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "Dad tried to warn us about Mom, but she stopped him. She's been lying about everything, and I've been helping her destroy you for crimes she committed herself." The pain in my brother's voice was unbearable because I knew how much it hurt to realize you'd been manipulated by someone you trusted completely. Working together for the first time in over a year, Tyler and I carefully documented everything Dad had hidden. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showing Linda had been stealing from grandmother for years, recordings proving she'd manipulated Dad during his illness, letters detailing her affair and threats against family members who discovered her secrets. Dad had essentially built a complete criminal case against his own wife, knowing she was dangerous but unable to act because of his illness. Tyler's guilt over his role in my persecution was consuming him. He'd been Linda's weapon against me, believing every lie she'd told, helping her spread false accusations throughout our community. "How do we prove Dad wasn't lying too?" he asked, voicing the fear that Linda would claim our father had been mentally compromised by his illness and pain medication. It was a valid concern because desperate people attack the credibility of evidence when they can't refute the facts. Linda's reaction to Tyler's discovery was immediate and violent. When he confronted her with Dad's letters, she went into a rage unlike anything he'd ever seen. She screamed that Dad had been paranoid and delusional, that his medications had made him suspicious and unreliable, that Tyler was being manipulated by me just like his father had been. But her panic was obvious, and Tyler could see the fear behind her anger. The suicide threats escalated to actual attempts when Linda realized Tyler was turning against her. She locked herself in the bathroom with a bottle of sleeping pills, calling Tyler's name and saying goodbye, forcing him to break down the door and call paramedics. But Jake's surveillance revealed that she'd called Roger before taking the pills, timing the attempt to ensure rescue while traumatizing Tyler into submission. Tyler's courage in posting Dad's recordings on social media was the turning point that exposed Linda's decades of manipulation to the world. He shared the audio files where Dad begged Linda to stop stealing from grandmother, where she threatened to destroy his relationships with his children, where she admitted to forging documents and hiding money. The posts went viral within hours, shared by hundreds of people who'd previously believed Linda's victim narrative. The community reaction was swift and brutal. People who'd supported Linda and condemned me began commenting with shock and disgust at the recordings. Church members, neighbors, and colleagues in Austin started sharing their own stories about inconsistencies in Linda's accounts, suspicions they'd had but never voiced, red flags they'd ignored because she seemed like such a sympathetic victim. Roger abandoned Linda completely when the recordings went public, immediately contacting authorities to offer full cooperation in exchange for immunity from prosecution. He provided evidence of Linda's affair timeline, financial records showing how inheritance money had funded their relationship, and recordings of conversations where she'd planned the systematic destruction of my reputation and legal standing. Eleanor Walsh moved quickly to have all charges against me dropped, armed with overwhelming evidence that Linda had fabricated every accusation. The arrest warrant was rescinded, the restraining order was dissolved, and prosecutors in both Texas and Colorado began building criminal cases against Linda for fraud, theft, perjury, filing false police reports, and elder abuse. The most beautiful moment came when Tyler called a press conference to publicly apologize for his role in my persecution. Standing before local news cameras, my little brother took full responsibility for believing lies and helping spread false accusations against me. "My sister Natalie is innocent of every charge our mother made against her," he said, his voice steady despite obvious emotion. "I was manipulated into becoming a weapon against my own sister, and I'll spend the rest of my life making amends for the pain I caused." Tyler's courage in exposing the truth had liberated us both from Linda's web of lies, but it had also revealed the depth of our father's suffering during his final months. Dad had known what Linda was capable of, had tried to protect us, had gathered evidence to ensure justice even after his death. His hidden legacy became the key that unlocked our prison and exposed a monster who'd been masquerading as a grieving widow and protective mother. The criminal case against Linda moved swiftly once Tyler's evidence gave prosecutors everything they needed for multiple felony charges. Eleanor Walsh worked with district attorneys in both Colorado and Texas to ensure my mother faced consequences in every jurisdiction where she'd committed crimes. The charges were serious: grand theft, fraud, elder abuse, perjury, filing false police reports, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Linda's desperation reached its peak when she realized that Tyler's betrayal had destroyed her carefully constructed victim narrative. She tried to flee Austin with the remaining inheritance money, booking a flight to Mexico under an assumed name. Airport security arrested her at the gate when the warrant appeared in their system, and news footage of her arrest showed a woman who looked nothing like the grieving widow who'd manipulated so many people. Roger's cooperation provided the final pieces of evidence prosecutors needed to prove Linda's systematic fraud. He testified about her elaborate planning, how she'd spent months creating forged documents and false evidence, how she'd coached him to support her lies about my supposed threats and mental instability. His testimony was devastating because it revealed the calculated nature of her crimes against me. The media attention surrounding Linda's arrest vindicated me in ways I'd never expected. Local news stations in both Chicago and Austin covered the story of a mother who'd framed her own daughter for theft and abuse. My former employer called to apologize and offer reinstatement with back pay, acknowledging they'd made a terrible mistake in terminating me based on fabricated accusations. Linda's trial was a spectacle that exposed the full extent of her manipulation and abuse. Prosecutors played recordings of her admitting crimes, presented bank records showing systematic theft, and called witnesses who described her lies about my supposed mental illness and threats. The defense's attempts to claim she was protecting Tyler from my abuse fell apart when confronted with overwhelming evidence of her guilt. Tyler's testimony was the most powerful moment of the trial. My brother described years of emotional manipulation, how Linda had turned him against me with elaborate lies, how she'd threatened suicide whenever he questioned her version of events. He admitted his role in spreading false accusations and explained how discovering Dad's hidden evidence had opened his eyes to the truth. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Linda was sentenced to 8 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution of the stolen inheritance plus damages for the harm she'd caused to my reputation and career. The judge described her crimes as a systematic campaign of psychological warfare against her own daughter. Roger received a lighter sentence in exchange for his cooperation, but his life was destroyed in other ways. His wife divorced him, taking half his assets and exposing his affair to their entire social circle. He lost his job when his employer learned about his involvement in fraud, and he faced civil lawsuits from both Tyler and me for his role in the conspiracy. The extended family members who'd believed Linda's lies began reaching out with apologies and explanations. Uncle David wept when he called me, describing how convincing Linda's fake evidence had been and begging forgiveness for turning his back on me. Cousins, family friends, and neighbors who'd shunned me for months admitted they'd been completely deceived by a master manipulator. My professional rehabilitation was swift once the truth became public. The marketing company that had fired me offered a significant settlement and a recommendation that helped me secure a better position with a competitor. Colleagues who'd avoided me during the scandal now treated me as something of a hero, someone who'd survived an unimaginable betrayal and emerged stronger. The process of reclaiming my inheritance was complicated but ultimately successful. Eleanor worked with forensic accountants to trace every dollar Linda had stolen, recovering money from the house in Austin, Tyler's college accounts, and assets Roger had purchased with inheritance funds. The total recovery was nearly $190,000, almost the entire original amount grandmother had left me. Tyler struggled with enormous guilt about his role in my persecution, but our relationship began healing as we worked together to rebuild what Linda had destroyed. He transferred to a state university that he could afford without stolen money, got a part-time job to support himself, and entered therapy to process the trauma of learning his mother was a criminal who'd manipulated him for years. The restraining orders that had prevented me from contacting my family were not only dropped but reversed. Linda was now prohibited from contacting Tyler or me, and she faced additional charges if she attempted any communication from prison. The legal system that she'd weaponized against me was now protecting me from her. The most satisfying moment came when I visited Linda in prison, not to forgive her but to see justice with my own eyes. She looked older, smaller, diminished by the orange jumpsuit and institutional setting. She tried one final manipulation, claiming she'd done everything to protect Tyler and that I was cruel to have destroyed the family. I simply told her that truth had won, that Dad's evidence had exposed her lies, and that she'd spend years paying for her crimes. I left without saying goodbye, finally free from her power to hurt me. The first time I visited Linda in prison wasn't about forgiveness or reconciliation. I needed to see with my own eyes that the woman who'd systematically destroyed my life was finally facing consequences for her actions. She looked diminished in her orange jumpsuit, sitting across from me in the visiting room with bulletproof glass between us. Even then, she tried to manipulate me one final time, claiming she'd been protecting Tyler from my supposed selfishness and that I was cruel for sending her to prison. Linda showed no genuine remorse for the years of psychological warfare she'd waged against me. She maintained that everything she'd done was justified, that I would have wasted grandmother's inheritance on my fancy city lifestyle, that Tyler deserved the money more than I did. Her complete lack of accountability helped me realize that she was incapable of the change I'd once hoped for. This wasn't the mother who'd raised me, this was a manipulative predator who'd worn my mother's face. I walked out of that prison knowing I'd never visit her again. The woman sitting in that cell wasn't someone worth saving or forgiveness. She was exactly who she'd chosen to become, a criminal who'd destroyed her own family for money and control. My healing couldn't include her because she was a cancer that would poison any relationship she touched. Therapy became essential for processing the trauma of systematic emotional abuse and gaslighting. My counselor, Dr. Sarah Chen, specialized in family trauma and helped me understand how Linda's manipulation had affected my ability to trust my own perceptions. Gaslighting victims often struggle with self-doubt long after the abuse ends, she explained. Your mother spent years making you question reality, and healing means learning to trust yourself again. The work was harder than I'd expected because the abuse had been so subtle and long-term. Linda had convinced me that I was selfish for pursuing my career, ungrateful for not visiting enough, responsible for family problems that she'd actually created. Dr. Chen helped me recognize these implanted beliefs and replace them with truth-based thinking about my worth and relationships. Rebuilding my career was surprisingly smooth once my name was cleared and the truth became public. The marketing industry is small, and word spread quickly about how I'd been victimized by an elaborate fraud. Companies that had previously rejected me based on false accusations now viewed me as someone who'd shown incredible resilience under pressure. I received multiple job offers and chose a position with a firm that specialized in crisis communications, where my personal experience with reputation management was considered an asset. Tyler's healing journey was more complicated because he carried enormous guilt about his role in my persecution. My brother had been Linda's primary weapon against me, spreading her lies and supporting false accusations that nearly destroyed my life. He'd entered therapy to process the trauma of learning his mother was a master manipulator who'd used him to abuse his own sister for years. Our relationship required careful rebuilding based on honesty about the damage that had been done. Tyler had to acknowledge that his actions had been harmful, regardless of his intentions or the manipulation he'd experienced. I had to find a way to forgive my brother while still holding him accountable for choices he'd made. It wasn't easy, but we both committed to doing the work required to rebuild trust and connection. The inheritance money that I finally recovered became a tool for healing rather than just personal wealth. I used a significant portion to establish the Rose Cooper Foundation, named after my grandmother, which provided legal aid and support services for family abuse survivors. Too many people suffer in silence when relatives weaponize the legal system or community opinion against them, and I wanted to ensure others had resources I'd almost lacked. Working with other survivors through the foundation taught me that family abuse is more common than most people realize. Adult children are often victimized by parents who steal their identities, drain their bank accounts, or destroy their reputations when they try to establish independence. The foundation's first year helped over 300 people escape similar situations, providing legal representation, counseling services, and temporary financial assistance. My dating life slowly resumed as I learned to open my heart again while maintaining healthy boundaries. The experience with Linda had made me hyper-aware of manipulation tactics and red flags in relationships. I was more cautious about trusting people, but also more confident in my ability to recognize and resist emotional abuse. The right person would respect my boundaries rather than try to push through them. Professional success came easier than personal healing, but both were important parts of reclaiming my life. I was promoted to senior director within 18 months, leading campaigns for clients facing reputation crises similar to what I'd experienced. My personal story became a powerful tool for helping others navigate false accusations and character assassination, though I was selective about when and how I shared those experiences. The most profound lesson from this nightmare was understanding the difference between family and relatives. Tyler had chosen to do the hard work of acknowledging his mistakes and rebuilding our relationship, earning his place in my life through actions rather than blood relation. Uncle David and several cousins had also made genuine efforts to repair the damage their rejection had caused. But Linda would always be just a relative now, someone who shared DNA but had forfeited any claim to being called family. 3 years after that devastating voicemail, I stood in my new apartment overlooking Lake Michigan, watching Tyler graduate from college with a degree he'd earned through his own hard work rather than stolen money. He'd rebuilt his life with integrity, taking responsibility for his education and his future. Seeing him walk across that stage, knowing we'd both survived Linda's attempts to destroy us, filled me with a peace I'd never thought possible. The scars from this experience will always be part of me, but they've become sources of strength rather than shame. I survived systematic psychological warfare from someone who should have protected me. I fought back against impossible odds and won justice for myself and my family. I learned that truth really can triumph over lies, but only if someone is brave enough to fight for it regardless of the cost. As I watch the sunset paint Chicago's skyline in brilliant colors, I often think about others who might be trapped in similar situations right now. Someone receiving a cruel voicemail from a parent, someone discovering that their family's love was conditional on their silence about abuse, someone wondering if they're strong enough to fight back against people who claim to love them while systematically destroying them. If you're in that situation right now, if you're questioning your own reality because family members are telling you that abuse is love, please know that you're not alone and you're not crazy. Trust your instincts, document everything, and remember that people who truly love you don't weaponize that love to control and manipulate you. The truth is worth fighting for, even when the battle seems impossible to win. Have you ever experienced manipulation from family members who claimed they were protecting you? How do you think you would have handled discovering that a parent had been systematically lying about you to destroy your reputation? Share your thoughts in the comments below because your story might help someone else who's struggling with similar betrayal. Don't forget to like this video if it resonated with you, subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming family trauma, and share this with anyone who might need to hear that surviving family abuse is possible. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that healing is possible even after the deepest betrayals. Your truth is valid, your pain is real, and your strength is greater than you know.